Good morning. My name is Leisha Brooks. I serve as the Chief of Staff and Culture with the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. Welcome to the launch of the Southern Poverty Law Center's 2021 Year in Hate and Extremism report. We're pleased today to present data, insights, and research presented by the SPLC's Intelligence Project team of research analysts and investigative journalists. Today, we're joined by a few of our nation's top leaders and advocates addressing hate and extremism, including Congressman Jamie Raskin, Maryland Democrat, representing District 8 and member of the Senate of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. We're also welcoming today Anila Aflazi, founder and executive director of MAPS Amen in Washington State, and Kai Harris, executive director of the Freedom Project Network in Mississippi. Anila and Kai are also featured in our 2021 Hate and Extremism report. We're pleased to, Today's briefing will also include a video segment from a conversation between SPLC President and CEO Margaret Huang and Mr. Bennie G. Thompson, representing Mississippi's 2nd Congressional District since 1993. He's also chair of the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Without delay, let's begin the panel discussion on the 2021 Year in Hate and Extremism report with SPLC's Intelligence Project Director and Research Analyst Cassie Miller, Rachel Carol Rivas, and Susan Cork.
Thank you so much, Leisha. And thank you all again for joining us today. SPLC has been reporting on and exposing hate and extremism since the 1980s, and the Year in Hate and Extremism is our flagship annual report. Since 1990, SPLC has provided this annual census of the number of groups operating within the United States. We couldn't be prouder of the team of Intelligence Project experts who assembled it. We really see this work as a partnership with all of you who are concerned about the impact of hate and extremism on democracy. Countless journalists, universities, organizations, and leaders around the world employ our research findings to enrich their stories and raise awareness of the threat that hate and extremism pose to our nation. Thank you. Please keep doing that. The organizations we have designated on our hate group list vilify others because of their race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender identity. These are prejudices that strike at the heart of our democratic values. In addition to hate groups, the SPLC monitors a sector of the radical right known as anti-government extremists. Groups we list as anti-government see the federal government as an enemy of the people, and they promote baseless conspiracy theories, generally involving a secret cabal of elites seeking to institute a global totalitarian government, a new world order, so to speak. I have to say, tracking hate and extremist group activity and membership is extremely and increasingly difficult. It is emotionally draining work for my team. They use a variety of different and complex methodologies. Some of the groups we track try to obscure their activities, while others exaggerate their operations. I just want to underscore one thing. To make a list, a group must actively have engaged in hateful and extremist activities in the past calendar year. So I'll turn now to the report. If we could bring up the hate map, I appreciate it. I'll begin by highlighting a few key themes, and then I'll turn to the co-authors of the main essay in our Year in Hate and Extremism report, Cassie Miller and Rachel Carol Rivas. They will expand on their research of the hate and anti-government extremist groups. The number of groups SPLC counts has declined for the 3rd straight year. We now count 1,221 active hate and anti-government extremist groups. Cassie and Rachel will break that down for us. I want to stress these numbers do not, however, demonstrate a decline in the power of the far right. So We changed the report a little bit this year, you'll see, to show the broader threat landscape and put the influence of the groups into context. Because hate and extremism haven't actually declined, the question is, what does that mean? It means that they are more decentralized and they're harder to track. Fewer people are opting to be card-carrying members of these organizations, which in a way is a measure of the success that they're having their day in court and being found guilty. And, we continue to expose them, which helps bring accountability. A key finding this year is hate and extremist ideas are operating more openly in the mainstream, with those subscribing to these beliefs running for office and school boards, becoming law enforcement and judges, and leveraging social media to manufacture misinformation. They are radicalizing our most promising research, our children. I have a 7-year-old mixed race child, and now for me, the fight is really personal. What we see evolving is a continuum from the mainstream to an empowered hard right movement that is undermining our democracy. It is converging around a willingness to engage in political violence. This radical faction is rising within one of our 2 political parties, the Republican Party, and it is becoming more prevalent in our communities than ever, because that is actually a political strategy to divide communities around issues of race, gender, inclusive education, vaccines. Shockingly, since January 6th, many Republicans, not all to be clear, have embraced or allowed increasingly violent rhetoric and wondered aloud whether violence might become a political necessity. That's pretty scary stuff. Finally, I want to emphasize that the rise of the radical right has real-world consequences. For voter suppression is targeting people of color, attacks on inclusive education and on transgender and gay people. There are deadly terror attacks that have been inspired by racist conspiracy theories. And therefore, we have had to adapt our monitoring to watch where the extremists are. They have been flourishing on the internet. This year, we saw them increasingly embrace live streaming technologies. That's a tactical shift for extremists in how they are fundraising, promoting in-person events, and preserving an archive of their work. So I just want to end on this. Democracy is under threat. This is an alarm bell, and protecting democracy will require pushing back against the rise of the hard right. I'll end there, and I will turn to Cassie Miller, who can talk about the trends and the numbers for hate groups and what they mean for us. Over to you, Cassie.
Thank you, Susan. In 2021, we documented 733 active hate groups. And as Susan said, hate groups are those that vilify others based on their immutable characteristics, things like race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And this is the 3rd year in a row that we've seen the number of hate groups decline. But we shouldn't see that decline in groups to mean that the influence of right-wing extremism is diminishing in American politics. What we're seeing is actually the opposite, that extremist groups are declining because the ideas that mobilize them now operate so openly in the political mainstream. And so far-right organizing doesn't need to take place in hate groups when those extremist ideas are already part of the larger political conversation, when there are so many places online across so many different platforms where extremists can organize, propagandize, and recruit without ever having to join a formal group. So what we're describing in this report, it's not just hate groups that exist on the fringes of society. It is a hard right mainstream political movement, and it's made up of a variety of actors. And that includes hate groups and anti-government extremist groups, but it also includes Trump loyalists, right-wing think tanks, media organizations, and activists who have real political power. And because they have that access to power, they've really been able to dominate public debate and spread conspiracies and misinformation, and really to become one of the most powerful forces shaping American politics today. Many of the groups that we track are really trying to take advantage of this moment because they feel that their ideas have traction within the American electorate and within the halls of power. And white nationalist groups in particular are really trying to harness the grievances of Trump supporters into an openly ethno-nationalist political movement. And it's one that they hope will eventually form the core of the GOP. That's the goal of white nationalists like Nick Fuentes' America First Foundation, which was formed this year and which we list as a hate group. Fuentes is a racist, anti-Semitic live streamer. He was on the ground at the Capitol on January 6th, and he is trying to build a young cohort of extremists to take over the GOP. And he has connections to the party. Last month, Representatives Paul Gosar and Marjorie Taylor Greene both spoke at his America First Political Action Conference, and they did so alongside a handful of other elected officials. And we're seeing other signs that dangerous white supremacist ideas are really getting a greater toehold in the mainstream, which is where they can do the most damage. This year, we saw Fox News pundit Tucker Carlson, as well as numerous elected officials, reference the Great Replacement, sometimes using that phrase itself. And that is a conspiracy theory that says that political elites are trying to systematically and deliberately replace white people with non-whites through policies like immigration. And I think it really bears emphasizing that the Great Replacement is the central narrative that is driving the white nationalist movement. And now it has moved beyond the pages of terrorist manifestos, and it's being repeated and lent legitimacy by people with real power and influence. And when you combine that with this hard right effort to silence conversations about racism in our schools and in other public places, what you create is an atmosphere where anti-Black, anti-immigrant, and ethno-nationalist policies can really further take root. And one of the strongest reactionary campaigns that we are tracking right now is being led by anti-LGBTQ activists, and it is especially targeted at trans people. We documented 65 anti-LGBTQ groups in 2021, and most of them are focused on the state level, on creating state-level legislation to ban trans-inclusive curriculum, to deny gender-affirming care, and to criminalize people who are providing that care. And this is a case where we can very clearly see the danger that extremist ideas can do when their proponents have access to real political power. In this case, they've created policies that actively harm people, and young people in particular, and created an atmosphere where violence against trans people is rampant. And that is what we're really worried about and trying to raise up in this report, that hate and extremism are being normalized, that they exist in the mainstream and are being put into policy, and that the hard right is threatening to overtake one of our two main political parties. So with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Rachel Carroll Rivas, who is going to talk about her research into the anti-government extremist movement.
Thank you, Cassie. Anti-government groups are clearly part of the anti-democracy hard right, and this year exemplified that like no other. These groups believe the federal government is tyrannical and they traffic in conspiracy theories. The Southern Poverty Law Center identified 488 anti-government groups in 2021. This includes 92 militias, 75 sovereign citizen groups, 3 constitutional sheriff organizations, and 52 conspiracy propagandist groups. This is the 4th year of decline in the number of anti-government groups the Southern Poverty Law Center tracks from a peak in 2017. We have listed 38 new anti-government groups in 2021, including notably Protect America Now, a new sheriff organization, Ma Militia, a women's-focused militia-affiliated group, and a number of groups focused on the southern border like Arizona Desert Guardians. Balancing out these new groups is a notable decline in militia groups, 77 fewer in fact. While many militia organizations remained active, some disaffiliated with their national organization, engaged in more covert activity, and were pressured to reorganize. Over 3 dozen Oath Keeper chapters and 15 3%er affiliated groups dissolved in 2021. This may be in response to the accountability and the scrutiny by the public, the media, and law enforcement after January 6th. The future of the militia movement in particular will be determined by how communities hold these groups accountable going forward. There is clearly a direct link between the groups we study and the violence on January 6th. The attack was the most public moment for the anti-government movement since the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. At least 20 Oath Keepers were present, and their leader, Stuart Rhodes, has been arrested for his participation. Anti-government activists are facing seditious conspiracy charges so rare that they have only been brought 4 times in the last 80 years. 9 people associated with the 3% movement have also been arrested for their participation. The post-January 6th scrutiny on the movement has resulted in law enforcement action and some deplatforming online, and that has reduced the number of groups, but not necessarily the salience of the anti-government movement. The animating narratives of this movement are widespread in the United States. The primary grievances that underpin the movement, in particular the distrust of the government and the absolute take on gun rights, are far too common. Egged on by the anti-government activists, many have pushed to continue easing firearm restrictions based on fear and false conspiracies. Gun sales in 2021 reached historic levels, further setting the stage for political violence. With heavy national pressure weighing them down, anti-government extremists have taken their fight and their message to the local level, and they have returned to the bread and butter tactics of focusing on local institutions, targeting public health boards, school boards, and election officials. And important factions of the movement, like the John Birch Society, have grabbed on to the anti-vaccine and anti-mask disinformation. Unfortunately, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about a secret plot to take over the government continue to underpin this movement, and now they have been brought to an even wider audience. Out west, Ammon Bundy's People's Rights Organization held a variety of small-scale demonstrations for grievances over taxes, property rights, and natural resources. Throughout 2021, Bundy organized a series of stunts and acts of political intimidation. Other groups in the Southwest focused on the border, engaging in vigilante activities against migrants, and some used those relationships with Border Patrol agents to circumvent and legitimize their vigilante activity. And efforts to engage law enforcement in extremist activities were expanded with a focus on county sheriffs by the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, drawing dozens of sheriffs to events across the country last year. In 2021, the anti-government movement was characterized by the coalescing of QAnon adherents with sovereign citizens, and of constitutional sheriffs and militia members with conspiracy-minded anti-vaxxers. This has produced a dangerous environment leading into 2022, where groups can openly recruit and market their ideas to each other and the general public. You can draw a straight line from our list to January 6th, and 2021 showed beyond a doubt that they will not go quietly. These 488 anti-government militia groups are just a window into the threat to our democracy today. Back to you, Susan.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel, for that insightful and frightening look into anti-government groups. So I wanted to kick off with a few questions for both of you and expand on the Hate and Extremism report a bit more. The first question is for you, Cassie. One of the findings of the report was that there was a dramatic increase in the number of Proud Boy chapters, despite there being a number of arrests, including this week, of group members after January 6th. What does this growth signify in terms of understanding hate movement activity?
Yeah, one of the most notable findings from the report this year is the dramatic increase in the number of Proud Boys groups. Last year, there were 43 chapters, and this year we recorded 72. That's an increase of 29, which is a pretty alarming rise. The Proud Boys are a group of so-called Western chauvinists. It's an all-men's group. They were formed in 2016, and they have a long history of violence and using intimidation and force to try and intimidate people who they consider their political enemies. They were one of the primary organized groups that was behind the January 6th insurrection. And at least 40 members of the group are now facing charges for their role in the insurrection. And that includes Enrique Tarrio, who was just arrested yesterday and is facing conspiracy charges along with other leaders of the group. And so this is a group that is facing really immense legal pressure. And historically, when this happens, it leads to a lot of infighting within the group. And normally these groups kind of crumble under that sort of pressure. But in some ways, we've really seen the opposite. Despite all this legal pressure, 2021 was the most active year for the Proud Boys since they were formed in 2016. And they primarily relied on local level organizing So we've all heard these sort of moral panics about things like masking and vaccines and school curriculum. And Proud Boys really latched on to those ideas, and they used it to kind of launch themselves into more mainstream spaces and get involved in local level politics. And in doing so, to really normalize their role in mainstream right-wing spaces. And that allows them to build alliances and make them more of a danger than they already are. And I think that the Proud Boys, a group that is facing these setbacks, that they were allowed to become more and more active this year, really shows us that the political terrain in the US has shifted towards authoritarianism and this sort of Proud Boys brand of politics. This isn't happening in a vacuum. This is happening when a lot of political leaders on the right are voicing support for political violence. And that has an impact, and it gives the okay to a lot of groups like this. And we see its impact on our communities. And we need to think about how that is going to play out as we move further into 2022, especially with the midterms, and what kind of violence that could bring about.
Thank you, Cassie. That's a very sobering analysis, I think, for all of us. Turn to you, Rachel. The report talks about how different groups latched onto local issues, masking, schools, inclusive education, to mobilize support and mainstream their activity. Can you tell us a little bit about what does this look like on the ground in communities that are affected?
Yeah, Susan, local communities across the US are just feeling the weight of harassment, intimidation, and even violence as extremist groups have latched on to the issues like masking and vaccines and inclusive education. We've seen particularly harsh activity directed at school boards and county health boards, where some groups have formed to target these officials, and other long-standing national organizations have simply used the unease around the pandemic to manipulate people's fears and mobilize resentment against democratically elected decision makers and their fellow community members. As an example of a local initiated action in Northern California, anti-government groups came together to push for the Shasta County supervisor to be recalled following California's COVID-19 health guidelines. And similarly, health officials resigned in communities from Michigan to Idaho under pressure from groups. And that vitriol and bullying that has rained down from these newly formed parent groups has forced library directors to resign and split local education institutions. A new SPLC listed groups like Long Island Loud Majority have made local volunteer school board members say they feel like they have become the enemy. And they've described their board meetings as a dangerous place where a lot of people don't feel welcome or safe. Local communities know this is a problem, and so do we. And unfortunately, we've identified it as a trend across the US in 2021. And other local intimidation tactics were on display in 2021 by hate groups that Cassie spoke about. Patriot Front blanketed communities with thousands of hateful flyers targeting Jewish people, Black and Brown people, and LGBTIQ people. The flyers are the kind of public display that may only be perpetrated by a few people, but they can leave a heavy impact on local communities. Exposing the groups, telling the true story, and decoding the rhetoric is part of how we use this report to take away their power. And the manipulation by the national anti-government firebrands played out as tours where they descend upon local communities, they train up locals in divisive ideology and tactics. In 2021, the Reawaken America and Arise USA tours featured a mix of known extremists, alternative health traffickers, politicians, religious right figures, and the events featured January 6 participants and organizers, and they spread the false tale of the big lie of a stolen election. These events supported the many bad changes to voting rights that stained state houses around the country. And let me be clear, Susan, the threat that we see to local communities is incredibly serious, and it affects the lives of people directly every day. Extremists want their conspiracy theories and their negative story to stand as the truth. But communities can just tell a much more powerful story, and they can create inclusive democracy from the ground up.
Thank you, Rachel, for ending on a note of hope that as much as we have outlined all of the really challenging and terrifying things that are going on, there are things that we can do. And I wanted to turn now back to Leisha. we have questions coming in from participants. So over to you, Alicia, to facilitate a question and answer session.
Thank you so much, Susan, Cassie, and Rachel. Yes, there are a couple of questions that have come in. I'll direct this one to you, Cassie. Aside from January 6th, what were some of the important moments in 2021 that tell us something about the strengths and the weaknesses of the far right?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things to point to is a lot of what Rachel was just saying, that a lot of the important events were happening at a community level. The year started out with January 6th, when the entire nation was watching our Capitol be attacked. And in the aftermath, extremists have sort of recalibrated, and they've stayed away from places like Washington, D.C. because they're afraid of law enforcement infiltration, the kind of attention that would bring on them. And instead, they've kind of focused more on the state level, on the local level. They're going to school board meetings. They're going to protest. They are going to city council meetings. And so in some ways, that's much less obvious to people. They think maybe this movement has lost steam, but I don't think it has at all. It hasn't dissipated. They've just changed their tactics. And so that's really where we're kind of focusing our eyes right now as we're tracking this movement. And that doesn't mean that we might not see another major event, but one place we're looking are places like state houses and polling places to make sure that those places are protected, because that's where extremists really have their sights set on right now.
Thank you, Cassie. And you're absolutely right. We need to keep our eyes glued to where hate is popping up. It's not over for sure. Rachel, I'm coming to you with the next question. What limits on government authority and domestic government authority and domain exist or should exist related to confronting hate and extremism?
Yeah, and I would also invite Susan to chime in here as well. But the reality is that, it's got to be a mix when we take on these issues. It's a mix of public and media accountability to the groups that perpetrate these activities. And also, the government has many tools in their tool belt right now to be able to use. And thankfully, in regard to January 6th, we've seen some of that be the case. But there's so much more they can do to address this issue from, quite frankly, the local, state, and the federal level. And I think that there's really just the use of the tools in their tool belt right now, and then expanding on looking at these groups, engaging in communities, investing in communities to make sure that they can really build up the resiliency that is important to be able to combat these groups. And I'll invite Susan to add to this also.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And that, your emphasis on what communities can do, I think is really important. And we will later in the session talk more about that. I've also seen a couple of questions come in on the chat in terms of technology, the influence of tech and social media companies. So another area I would really underscore is that we need to hold tech and social media companies accountable. They need to be enforcing their terms of service to deplatform hate and extremism. And that has been happening. They should be required to make data available to academics and researchers. Payment service providers should disrupt the funding of hate online. A lot of our reporting has shown how extremists are making a living by posting online. So there should be mandatory transparency and reporting requirements. And then, as Rachel said, we need to improve the government response to domestic extremism. We need to pass new laws in addition to enforcing what already exists, as Rachel said. We could enact the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, implement the new COVID-19 Hate Crime Act, to name a few. So, and finally, hold the perpetrators of January 6th accountable.
Thank you, Susan. Let's go back to your comment about how these actors are using technology. What resources exist to confront hate and to build strength within our communities?
Thank you, Alicia. That's a great question. And it's something that we in the Intelligence Project and SPLC as a whole have been focusing on a lot. on putting resources and research into prevention efforts. During the pandemic, not surprising insight is that children who were learning at home were spending huge amounts of time online, and they were isolated and scared, and parents were themselves balancing too many things. So these are all factors that make people vulnerable to radicalization. So something that we did is we created a partnership with Perel Laboratories at American University and have been working with them and increasing our work with them to develop, to understand the pathways to radicalization. And we published a guidebook for parents, caregivers, educators to understand the warning signs and to have strategies to intervene and help their children off ramp before they go down a path of radicalization. This is something that we believe is so necessary, and more needs to be done, more investment from the government. And these strategies work. Our guidebook, the research, if parents spent just 7 minutes reading it, they were more than 80% said that they were better prepared to understand the warning signs and better prepared to intervene. So these strategies on intervention work, and we're also working with Perel to develop inoculation strategies as well.
Thank you so much for mentioning that Perel work, and I'm sure our colleagues will drop that information in the chat so folks can access that tremendous resource. This is the last question. Rachel, I'm going to go to you, but feel free to kick it to someone else. The southern border has become a flashpoint among the far right during the Biden administration. How have extremist groups coalesced around the Texas-Mexico border?
Yeah, absolutely. We did list a number of new groups and groups that continue to exist that are part of the anti-government militia movement that focus on the southern border. These groups target migrants. They are also using, really leaning into the QAnon conspiracies, in some ways manipulating people around the idea of, quite frankly, saving children, which is really unfortunate. But on top of that, these groups are using, nativist anti-immigrant rhetoric, and they're fueling off of the political rhetoric that is all too common around the vitriol against immigrant communities. And we've seen engagement by these militia groups on the border at times, as I mentioned before, engaging with Border Patrol agents and sheriff's organization entities, these government entities, to legitimize their harassment of migrants, and then to further the idea that there really is this threat. And again, a reference to Cassie's work and talking about the Great Replacement theory. And so this is a circular issue and quite a problem. And we hope folks will read more in the report about the groups we've listed on the border and really educate themselves so they can be armed to confront this really unfortunate set of ideas and activities.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much, Susan, Cassie. Thank you for providing this snapshot of what we can expect from SPLC's 2021 Year in Hate and Extremism report. If you're interested in learning more about a report, please click on that link in the chat. And if you have more questions or would like to interview one of our experts, please email us at press@splcenter.org. Our next panel focuses on community resilience. SPLC Chief Program Officer Ann Beeson will host a conversation with activists who are boldly and courageously taking a stand against hate and extremism within their communities. Ann, welcome.
Thank you so much, Leisha. As my colleagues have shared, SPLC's Year in Hate and Extremism report is about trends in hate and extremism in America. And especially with hate and extremism becoming more mainstream, it's more important than ever to lift up the voices of unity and resilience in our communities as well. So this year in our report, we're highlighting specific ways that Americans are changing lives and overcoming hate through action. I am so delighted today to introduce you all to two incredible community activists. Anila Afzali is the founder and executive director of the American Muslim Empowerment Network at the Muslim Association of Puget Sound, or better known in Washington State as MAPS Amen. The organization educates fellow Americans about Islam and Muslims, builds and mobilizes coalitions to counter hate and advocate for justice, challenges negative stereotypes and misinformation, and empowers and engages the American Muslim community. Welcome, Anila. We're also joined by Kai Harris, Executive Director of the Freedom Project Network, which is a Mississippi-based organization that supplements student education with programming geared toward agency and empowerment. So Kai, let's begin with you. We are seeing unprecedented attacks on inclusive education, and there's a clear link between these attacks and the rise of hate and extremism. At SPLC, our Learning for Justice team produces classroom guides and other resources for teaching hard history, and we are so grateful for community partners in this critical work, like you and your organization. Your work at the Freedom Project Network is centered on youth and grounded in liberation education. Can you tell us what liberation education means and how the Freedom Project Network is using it to confront the history of hatred and racism in this country?
Thank you, Anne. And first, let me say, big agree. There is so much synergy between SPLC's Learning for Justice work and the work that we do at the Freedom Project Network. So just excited to share the space with you and Anila this morning. So when I think about what liberatory education looks like, three things come to mind. It acknowledges humanity, it is holistic and reaches the whole student, and also it ultimately creates agency. So first, when I say acknowledging humanity, our schools, our nation's schools and school system more broadly sees our students as faceless numbers associated with metrics. Students are dropped into this factory assembly line model of education where they move through the K through 12 conveyor belt and are pumped with information that is more often than not irrelevant to their lived experiences, and are then pumped out as products that exist to serve the workforce. But a liberatory education really acknowledges that our students are human first and that they bring rich histories and cultures and diverse identities and experiences into the classrooms, and that their humanity, first and foremost, should always be the centerpiece of how we approach teaching and learning. My second point of being holistic builds off the first one, really, in that liberatory education acknowledges that there is so much more to the world than reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? And as educators, we must also prioritize the mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, social well-being of our students, and must ground students in culturally relevant history and provide opportunities for them to explore their artistic and creative energies. And then my third point about liberatory education's ultimate goal being to create agency. More often than not, our nation's schools pigeonhole our students into very narrow ranges of future opportunities, especially for students from historically marginalized communities. And so a liberatory education helps students access the experiences, resources, and tools that will enable them to lead the lives that they want to live. So it's not you must go to college to be successful and do your best to make it within the system that already exists. But instead it is, let's really intentionally explore who you are, who you want to be, and what you want your impact on the world to be. And whatever those answers are, we should be helping you to position yourself to realize those dreams. So that's what a liberatory education means to me. And I just imagine how much better off our country would be if every student's educational experiences were grounded in those ideas.
Absolutely, Kai. I was thinking the same thing as you were talking. If only our public education system adopted your framework, so we can work on that together for sure. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Anila, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the collapse of the government there in August of 2021 led to many refugees being resettled in the United States. Your organization has worked really hard to welcome these refugees and to push back against the voices of hate that have attacked them. Can you tell us about the work that MAPS Amen has been doing in response to the situation and what you've learned about challenging Islamophobia in this country?
Absolutely. And hello, Anne and Kai. It's an honor to be here with both of you and the entire team at the Southern Poverty Law Center and our audience today for this important conversation. And I'm also really glad that SPLC is uplifting stories of community resilience amidst just the hate and hate groups that we're seeing as well. So I appreciate this opportunity to be able to talk about some of the work that we are doing at a local level. So with the arrival of Afghan refugees in our country, of course, one of the beautiful things has been the bipartisan support, at least initially, to welcome and support Afghan allies who stood shoulder to shoulder with our U.S. troops over the course of 20 years in Afghanistan. But we also knew that that bipartisan support could fade. And we're starting to see some of that already. We knew there was going to be an inevitable increase in xenophobia and Islamophobia with an influx of all of these sort of new brown, often Muslim arrivals coming in different places. And we also knew that some, including those in positions of power, were going to exploit the opportunity to really spread divisiveness and promote bigotry as well. And as Afghans were arriving, they're of course arriving in this larger context of hate groups and the normalization of hate and conspiracy theories, as we heard from our previous panel, along with the general existence of xenophobia, Islamophobia, and the attacks on Muslims and Muslim places of worship, including here in Washington state. So one of the things that we knew we had to do is to be proactive in our work in creating a welcoming environment. So what we did is we created and distributed these signs that I hope you can see behind me that really emphasize this message of welcoming our Afghan neighbors. And we joined the governor of the state of Washington, the Port of Seattle, other elected leaders, corporate partners, and more, along with our resettlement agencies and community-based organizations in a press conference early on to emphasize a welcoming environment for the incoming Afghans. We've also taken on a unique leadership role in responding to this crisis, in part because I myself am Afghan American and have the connections culturally and otherwise to do this work. We've been able to partner directly with the state of Washington in coordinating, overseeing the coordination of resettling and welcoming Afghan arrivals in Washington state. And part of this work of sort of addressing xenophobia that we're inevitably going to see is directly in line with the work we've been doing for years, combating anti-Muslim sentiment, but also doing so in a way that recognizes the interconnectedness of these various forms of hate and oppression. As I often say, I cannot combat Islamophobia if I'm not also combating anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism and anti-Asian hate or anything else that we may need to challenge as part of our work. We maintain this collective liberation perspective, and especially because we understand how much crossover there is in the hate groups and the conspiracy theories that they use to perpetuate their narrative and their messaging. So in light of sort of all of that and in the work that we've done in combating hate and Islamophobia and more, some of the lessons that we've learned specifically include the importance of having positive, proactive messaging to create welcoming environments, having leaders and the general public engage in this part of creating that welcoming environment. This is why we have our welcome signs, and also calling out double standards and the promotion and perpetuation of tropes and misinformation that we may see in places like media and Hollywood, certainly the double standards with respect to how Muslims are portrayed in media versus other groups. And now we're seeing the double standards in media even around how Afghan refugees, for instance, or Syrian refugees or Palestinians or others might be presented or represented in media versus Ukrainian refugees, for instance. So we are seeing these kinds of double standards, and we need people to be vocal about them. And we also, very importantly, need to get at the institutional forms of hate, the things that are systemic, not just the symptoms, which may be individual acts of hate or violence. So we really need to challenge that, including by challenging the funding and support for that kind of broader hate and Islamophobia and xenophobia and more. But that's where I'll stop for now. But I just want to really emphasize the importance of also, through all of this, celebrating and uplifting those stories of resilience and making sure our positive narratives are stronger than the narratives of hate and disunity.
Oh, thank you Thank you so much, Anila. That's just so inspiring. And I love your beautiful sign in the background. And thanks for all that you're doing. And Kai, all that you're doing. And I will just invite actually our audience out there. I would just really welcome shout outs to Anila and Kai in particular for their great work and all the great work that others like them are doing in your communities. Our report documents the mainstreaming of hate and extremist ideas and behavior. And as Kai and Anila, your work makes clear, these ideas are deeply rooted in our country's long legacy of racism and white supremacy. And it's going to take all of us working together and our movements to undo this. Kai, how do you see education as a core element of movement building to stop the spread of hate in Mississippi?
That's a great question. Sorry, I'm like still processing everything that Anila just blessed us with. That was powerful. But yeah, I guess for me, first, I look at history, and you look at the history of this country, and I wonder, well, why was it illegal for enslaved people to learn to read? Why were there literacy tests that kept people from voting? Why is there such a spirited movement to prevent the truth about our country's history from being taught in our classrooms? And the answer is because education and the truth through education has always been the seed that blossoms all freedoms, and that what ignites the spirit for change in our communities. And so for me, the more that education is controlled by those who benefit from immense privilege and power, the status quo will always be reinforced and cycles of oppression will continue to persist. But the more that we see and leverage education as a tool for liberation, the more that we can build a movement of young people specifically who are prepared to dismantle oppressive systems and rebuild just ones in their place. And back to the point about history, that's also evidenced through history, because young people and education have always been at the center of almost every social movement that has sparked positive change. So we just got to continue to carry that legacy forward.
Beautifully said, Kai. Anila, I loved what you shared about the importance of positive messages, and we just invite you to share a little more with us about what is working to change hearts and minds in Washington State, and what more you'd like to share about what we can do to work together to build a bigger movement.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I was inspired by what Kai was saying too, and the importance of education in challenging white supremacy and oppressive systems. And I would add to that Christian hegemony as well in our country. And the things that have been working in Washington State and in doing this work, I would say most importantly from our perspective, from my perspective, would be building coalitions, because we cannot do this work alone. And I also often say that we can't rely on, the president or Congress or the courts to save us. It's really up to us, we the people. We're the ones who need to build sort of movements that are multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multilingual, multi-generational, multi-everything, in order to challenge these forms of hate, of bigotry, and really build those relationships that we need to have in place before instances of hate or violence take place. We need to use even as we do that, we need to use every instance where there is hate or violence. We need to use those opportunities to further our solidarity, our support, and showing up for each other. So it's really critical for us to continue to build relationships of trust and to have those in place both before and continue to strengthen them, so that when haters try to promote their divisiveness, they'll see that it actually backfires, that it results in far more people coming together, standing in solidarity, standing with each other, and making sure that we speak up, speak out, condemn sort of the acts of hate, and take action together to combat it and be proactive. And like I said, in the positive messaging, because oftentimes, unfortunately, what people do, even allies, when they want to support marginalized communities, they may unintentionally reinforce negative stereotypes by using negative messaging, like saying, all Muslims are not this or that. And that simply reinforces that negative stereotype. Instead, it's far better to say, my Muslim neighbors are are engaged in serving the community or doing this. So positive messaging definitely is important. But I also want to add that it's very easy for everybody to get on board and condemn those individual acts of ugly hate and violence, but it's far harder to get engaged and be there to challenge the underlying systems. And that's where more of our work really, really needs to focus, because we have solid support in Washington state, and anytime instances of hate occur, like a fifth attack on an Islamic center in Western Washington happened this Monday morning, unfortunately, with a car ramming itself into the prayer space of an Islamic center in Burien, Washington. So we had yesterday a press conference, and we had wide support from the community, and that is always there, which is fantastic. It's wonderful. We need to keep building that, but we also need to be there to challenge, again, the systems and all of the lead up to these kinds of individual symptoms of hate. We need to be sure we're active in challenging the funding, even the mainstream organizations that may perpetuate, promote, or permit these forms of hate and anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant or anti-people of color messaging to continue to continue in our nation. So that's where we really need to focus our work, is getting at the systemic forms, challenging the funding, and making sure that even when it's liberals, even when it's groups that call themselves civil rights organizations, if they are perpetuating or promoting these messages of hate, we need to be very active in that and stand firm in challenging any of that kind of support for these kinds of hateful messages, these hateful groups, or the infrastructure, the systems that permit these hateful rhetoric to lead to violent action.
Thank you so much, both of you, for these very concrete steps that we can all take to stand with you and stand with all of our communities in fighting hate. Your work is so inspiring, Anila and Kai, because it offers a different vision of the future of our country, one that welcomes and empowers people of all backgrounds. I want to ask just one more question before we hand it back to Alicia to bring in some questions from our audience. And that is, in doing this work every day, what gives you hope? And if we could just start with you, Kai.
Well, this space gives me hope. Honestly, a lot of it, I think to Anila's point, knowing that you're not alone in the fight and the struggle for justice is hugely important. And seeing that, it was funny hearing in the first half of the event that these right-wing groups are organizing, and through their organization, they are making moves, right? And so I think to Anila's point, we should respond by organizing ourselves and banding together and doubling down on what we know and believe is right. So just hearing other people who are doing powerful justice-focused work on the whole other side of the country, but rooted in the same ideas and the same struggle in solidarity from afar, that gives me hope. But even more so, everyone knows what I'm about to say probably. If you've heard me say anything, it's young people give me hope. That's why I do what I do, right? Young people, specifically the young people in Mississippi that I have the privilege of working with, are so brilliant and so resilient. And, I'm constantly reminded that if us adults can shut up and get out of the way and let them lead, then we would see that they have extremely powerful ideas about how we can build a world that is just, sustainable, and rooted in love and inclusivity. And so, I think about when some of the, never-ending instances of violence against Black bodies was happening early last year, and found myself really bummed about it, really emotional about it, and losing hope around, the future of our country, and had the opportunity to be in a space with some young people from our organization in a reflection and healing space, and was just really surprised by the fact that they were well, we don't want to just sit here and talk about how upset we are. We're all upset. Let's talk about how we can channel this anger and pain into collective action. And so to just be in a room full of young people who that was the energy that they're showing up to the table with, despite being faced with challenges in every facet of their lives, that the response to Anila's point is, how can we be strategic? How can we leverage the brilliance of our peers, our communities, to push and make demands for change. And so just so inspired to, see the future generation of young people building upon that spirit and energy, even in the face of that same energy and spirit sort of tugging in the other direction. And so my hope is that I can use anything that I have to be an influence to pull the rope in the direction of justice and equity. So that's what keeps me going.
Thank you so much, Kai. That's great. And I love this focus on action and collective action. And we're going to get even into more examples of that in our third and final panel about policy recommendations. But first, let me turn to you, Anila, and just ask, what gives you hope?
Yes, this question, I love it because we need hope during these times when often people do fall into despair. I will reiterate what Kai said, and I agree with him about the youth and the support of others who are doing this work. I will also add specifically my faith is what drives me and keeps me going and gives me the patience and the ability to continue this day in and day out. And I know from sort of my faith perspective that I'm not judged on the results. I'm judged on my efforts. I have to do my part. In addition to that, as Kai mentioned, sort of having support from others, having people constantly show up. I mentioned just yesterday morning, in less than 24 hours, we had support from elected leaders, from faith leaders of different traditions coming together, standing in solidarity against the instances of hate and injustice and anti-Muslim sentiment that we have repeatedly seen and experienced. So that constantly gives me hope. And with the Afghan refugee crisis, the really, again, the bipartisan support and everyday people stepping up to help out and do their parts, and especially some of the veterans who built relationships with their Afghan brothers and sisters over the course of the 20-year war in Afghanistan, that they're not letting go. They're continuing to even sometimes use some of their life savings to save their fellow Afghan brothers and sisters. That's really inspiring to me, and it continues to support me, especially at this time of difficulty since the crisis in Afghanistan. Just being Afghan American and having family even in Kabul that I'm trying to evacuate, it's been really, really hard, but the support of the community has kept me going. And finally, I will say the recognition that we stand on the shoulders of giants in doing this work. The civil rights movement leaders, those fighting for abolition, people who've struggled and faced far more hate and vitriol and challenges and obstacles than we're facing today. And we are sort of following in their legacy. So if they didn't lose hope, how can we? We cannot allow despair. Like, that is simply not an option. We can take breaks when needed, and that's appropriate for all of us, but we have to get back to doing the work. We have to maintain our hope, and we have to recognize that love and unity will always outweigh the hate and disunity messages that are constantly promoted. And we've also seen the changes, the impact on individuals that have been transformed through this process. In doing this work, I'm on the front lines of getting to witness those personal transformations that people have had. People have literally come to me and cried and admitted their own anti-Muslim bias and bigotry and hate that really darkened their own hearts, and how much they felt released from the hate when they had that positive interaction and learned to release the fear. And it's that kind of work, those kinds of instances that constantly give me the motivation, the drive to continue doing this work and knowing that in the end, we will win.
That's so beautifully said. Despair is not an option. I love this. So we're going to turn now. We've got a lot of great questions from our audience participants. So I'm going to hand it back to Leisha, and we'll all three stay on to help answer the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. Anila, Kai, thank you so much. I'm just so encouraged to go on another day, as they say. Kai, I'm coming to you with the first question. What should I do if my school community starts experiencing harassment because of critical race theory conspiracies? How do I support the teachers and students in my community?
That's a great question. A question that I don't have the full answer to, right? But I think, again, it goes back to what myself and Anila have been harping on this whole time about leveraging the power of the community itself. And so, I think oftentimes when we think about schools, we see like the school district as this immovable force. And I don't know, I always ground myself in the idea that, well, there's just like some human being that actually is probably pretty out of touch with the reality of the community. So what makes him so qualified to make the decisions about what our students learn, or what our classrooms are structured like, or what our schools look and feel like? And so if anyone should have a say in what our students learn and what our schools look like and feel like, and what it should be, our students, it should be their families. And so I think the more that we can just remain grounded and wait a minute, like, we don't have to just sit back and say, well, this is what the school district says is going to be, so we just got to go to school and deal with it. Like, no, you actually don't. Because if there weren't any parents and students, there would be no school. And so if we can center in that and actually, again, be smart about how we organize ourselves and get parents and young people and community advocates and policy leaders who believe what we believe in the room together, and say, how can we pull our resources together to make the demands against these oppressive systems, to create the school environments and the curriculums that we want to see. And it's long and it's slow, and obviously, like, these systems aren't immutable, right? Like, you have to navigate through them, but the most powerful tool we have is each other. And so the more that we can lean on each other and pull our resources together, the more we have potential to drive the change that we want to see.
It just makes so much sense, Kai. Thank you so much. And it reminds me of what you were saying earlier on around our agency, using our agency, exercising our agency. So thank you so much for that. Anila, the next question is coming to you. What advice do you have for other groups that may want to do similar work? And what are some of the biggest challenges that you've experienced?
Yes, I love hearing that question of others wanting to get engaged in the work. I will say one of the most important things is to get to know each other, to get to know members from marginalized communities, because oftentimes, unfortunately, marginalized groups, in part because of the stigma they may face, the ostracization, the stereotypes, the potential violence, sometimes they may sort of go inward. So it's really a challenge sometimes to engage and get to know members of marginalized groups. I'll use the Muslim community as one example. I will also say that the small numbers of Muslims or other marginalized groups makes it hard for everybody to have a deep personal relationship with their community members from these different groups. So be a little patient in doing this work, be a little patient in building those relationships, but really get to know your neighbors, number one. Number two, try to find opportunities to do work that is not necessarily related to those instances of hate or violence. I talk about service work together. I talk about doing justice advocacy on other issues that affect all of us as Americans, doing that kind of work together. Learn about different cultures, communities, and issues, specifically from the perspective of others who may not think like us. So learn about sort of different communities, but then also challenge ourselves and our viewpoints, and especially have the critical thinking skills when we look at what's happening and what's presented and promoted in media, in Hollywood, and more. There are many, many wonderful trainings now that are available for people who want to stand as allies to specific communities like the Muslim community or others. There are opportunities for doing that, but also getting out there and actually just building relationships with people is so critical. I will say one of the other challenges of that is that leadership changes, people change. So it's always disheartening to some when they built a relationship with one individual and then that individual moves out of the country, moves to a different state, and they feel like they have to start over. But that's why it's so critical to not just have relationships with one person, but with the broader community, and invite people to engage in different people's festivals, cultural traditions, holidays. We always have an annual interfaith iftar, for instance, during the month of Ramadan, to allow the wider community to come and get to know their Muslim neighbors and see the work that we've been doing and that we want to engage others in as well. But it's constant, and there is no stop for us. There is no pause in a lot of ways. This work is so critical, and especially in serving refugees, for instance, right now, a lot of people want to help, but race settlement agencies are overwhelmed. Community-based organizations are overwhelmed in responding to this unprecedented crisis. So there does require some patience, but there does require some persistence as well in wanting to continue to push and build those relationships and be involved. So those are some of the pieces of advice I would have. And read the material that's out there by so many different organizations. I can share some of the links in the chat if that's useful, but there's a lot of content that we can educate ourselves, educate our own communities, and do the work within our own communities that we need to combat the hate and misinformation against other communities. Like I do anti-racism work even within the Muslim community, for instance, right? Because it's needed. So we can do the work in our own community and build those relationships and help the wider community understand how interconnected our liberation is.
Thank you so much, Anil. I really appreciate that. And your reminder about this work, we have to keep doing the work. I also appreciate your advice around taking breaks, that it's okay for us to take breaks. This is hard work, and we're in it for the long haul. I know that you are, I know that Kai is, and that's what it's going to take. So appreciate you so much. We're coming up to the last question, and I'm going to see if they're going to put it on the screen or if I'm going to ask it. There you go. Oh. Excuse me a second. Let me ask the question to you, Anne, about funding. Folks were at, and I take it that people are so interested in what you're doing, Kai and Anila, wondering how they could do similar work and how might groups go about getting support around funding and deciding which topics to tackle within their community. And what would you say to folks that are listening?
Well, I think that so many great pieces of advice have been shared by Anila and Kai. That's the first thing about how to organize in our communities. And the first thing, that I would suggest is, get to know who else is like standing up to fight hate and promote inclusivity in your community. Find out what's already happening. Don't feel like you have to create something by yourself. Educate yourself first, get to know the groups that are already active, see how you can join with them, find out from them, how they're supporting their work. I do have to lift up, there's another incredible story in our report of community resilience about a group in Vermont that actually does cleanup of like hateful flyers around their community. And they actually then promote a fundraiser for the groups that were targeted based on their cleanup efforts. So they're actually using these instances of like hate flyering to actually raise money for the groups that are being targeted. And so that's just a beautiful model that I would encourage all of you to read about. So yeah, I guess that would be my primary advice is, first of all, find out who else is doing the work, stand in solidarity with them, learn from how they're raising money and supporting the work that they're doing. And as Anila and Kai have both shared beautifully, we can just accomplish so much if we're working together on the ground and then in an interconnected network of solidarity around the country.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Kai. Thank you, Anila. I just so appreciated this segment on community resilience. I just wanted to uplift a couple of things that I heard you say. Kai, starting with you around the acknowledging humanity, tied so nicely to what you were saying, Anila, too, about recognizing one another's humanity and making those connections, real connection, before hate hits our communities. And I love what you said and want to uplift that the narrative around unity being stronger than the narrative around disunity. And that is all on us. So thank you so much for all you do every day. Thank you for working in partnership with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And thank you and your teams for what you all are doing.
Thank you so much.
Up next, the video I promised earlier featuring SPLC President and CEO Margaret Huang in conversation with Congressman Bennie G. Thompson, representing Mississippi's 2nd Congressional District. He's also chair of the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Let's listen in as they discuss today's climate of hate and extremism.
Hi there. I'm Margaret Huang, President and CEO of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Today, I am delighted to be sitting down with Congressman Bennie Thompson. He is the longest-serving African-American elected official here in Mississippi, and he's also the lone Democrat of the Mississippi Congressional Delegation. We're sitting here today in Cultivation Food Hall in Jackson, Mississippi, which is Congressman Thompson's home state. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Congressman Thompson, we've seen a really dramatic uptick in the number of hate crimes being directed against the Asian American community. Like many of my colleagues and peers and family members, I was horrified by the shootings in Atlanta last year. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. And of course, I know you were very supportive of the COVID-19 hate crimes bill that passed last year. Perhaps one of the silver linings of seeing this rise in the number of hate crimes against the Asian American community, my community, is that I've learned a lot about the history of collaboration and solidarity between Asian Americans, African Americans in this country that goes back decades. And it's something I didn't fully know before these stories started coming out and before we started talking together about how we have to come together to fight these crimes. I'd love to hear your reflections on where we are in this country combating hate crimes and documenting what's happening in hate crimes across the country.
Well, you know, unfortunately, this country, up until very recently, did not like to label a crime as a hate crime. They say, oh, a crime is a crime. No, there are some crimes that are more egregious than others. And so now we have elevated certain crimes in this country to a standing where the penalty is greater. But what we have to do with that is understand what we have to put in place to mitigate those crimes from continuing to occur. Now, the mitigation requires conversation with those individuals who are directly impacted by the crimes. Too many times in this country, until very recently, people would say, oh, I know how it feels to be black. Not unless you black, you don't. Oh, I know how it feels, the Asian community feels when they are under attack. No, you don't, not unless you're Asian. So part of that is to bring those communities that feel the brunt of the attacks into the conversation. So that means you can't put a room full of non-Asians to solve an Asian problem. And so I've seen recently the Biden administration create inclusive opportunities for different people to be in the room. And a lot of people don't like that. They say, well, I don't know, like one of my senators say, it's a quota. Well, if you haven't had any of those people who we have wronged in the room, it's a problem.
Yeah. Congressman, it feels like the attacks on voting rights are really part of this larger threat that you're looking at as part of the January 6th Select Committee. There seems to be an incredible push toward a much more authoritarian regime. And that's really what I think the committee is trying to understand. You talked about the fact that there are lessons we can learn about how the government functions and responds, et cetera, but what do you hope the January 6th Select Committee is going to produce in the end? What can we anticipate?
Well, I think what you can anticipate is a statement of what actually occurred. You will look and see how federal resources were misused to orchestrate a lie. You'll see how federal organizations made missteps in identifying what was going on January 6th. But as important, you will see how wealthy Americans invested in promoting this lie through various organizations. Well, again, there's been no evidence that our committee has been able to uncover of any fraud, of any election irregularities. We've gone from Arizona to Georgia to Pennsylvania to Michigan to Minnesota to Wisconsin. We've talked to Democrats, Republicans, and they all say, look, none of what occurred would have altered the outcome of the election. In a majority of the states, the election officials were Republican. And so all those states where you have those Republican officials who wouldn't go along with the lie, they now have opponents.
Yeah.
I mean, so when did telling the truth become a penalty in this country? And so our hope is to recommend, first of all, that in the greatest democracy in the world, in elections, there are winners and losers. But it shouldn't become an insurrection after the election, like we saw on January 6th. And so we're going to put in place recommendations so that that never happened again.
Thank you, Congresswoman Raskin, for joining us. Congressman?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us. I recognize that this is a busy time for you. You're trying to keep the government doors open. So we really appreciate your willingness to engage in this really important conversation. I just really want to start out by thanking you for your service on the January 6th Select Committee. We owe you and your colleagues a debt of gratitude and appreciation, not only for your leadership in pushing back on authoritarianism, but also on white nationalism, hate, and political violence in this country. I can say with particular confidence that we can all sleep better at night just knowing that there are public servants like you who are in positions of power and are standing guard over the values and principles of our Constitution. So I want to say thank you. With that, why don't we just dive right into what's at stake with respect to hate and extremism in this country and what Congress is doing to address hate and political violence in the country. So our annual Hate in Year report, it documents over 1,200 active hate anti-government extremist groups. And while the number of groups have declined, these numbers do not demonstrate a decline in power of the far-right movement. What they suggest is that extremist ideas are now operating more openly in the mainstream. So I wonder if you could talk with us a little bit about how this mainstreaming of hate is threatening our democratic institutions and affecting our individual constitutional rights.
Yes, well, let's look at January 6th itself, where we had a very dense microcosm view of the role that white nationalist violence and extremism are playing in affecting public opinion and mainstream politics. You could consider what took place on January 6th as occurring in three rings of sedition. On the one hand, there was a mass so-called wild protest called by then President Trump, which turned into a mob riot. And that mob riot ended up injuring, wounding, and hospitalizing 150 officers who ended up with broken necks, jaws, vertebrae, arms, legs, lost fingers, traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress syndrome. The white nationalists' influence there was pervasive. The middle ring of the activity, the middle ring of sedition, was the realm of the insurrection. And this was dominated overwhelmingly by domestic violent extremist groups, white nationalists and extremist groups like the Proud Boys, who Donald Trump had told to stand back and stand by at the first presidential debate, the Oath Keepers, who've been charged with seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow the government, the Three Percenters, the QAnon networks, the militia groups, the Aryan nations were present as well, the Unification Church, various Christian white nationalist groups. So these were the groups that had tried to assemble and unite the right back in August of 2017, where about 500 of them arrived, and they were obviously able to do a lot of damage to Charlottesville and kill Heather Heyer and injure a lot of people. But by the time they got to Washington on January 6th of 2021, they were now they numbered in the thousands. And so people see the way that Donald Trump used this network of extremist groups, but they used him too. And they were able to grow and build their numbers and, of course, brag that they nearly knocked over the government of the United States. And the final ring of seditious activity was the realm of the coup, which is an odd word in American political parlance because we don't have a lot of experience with coups, and we think of a coup as something that takes place against a president. But this was a coup organized by the president against the vice president and against the Congress in a last-ditch effort to try to overthrow Joe Biden's victory in the Electoral College majority. But here again, you see the influence of racist white nationalist groups, because they were essentially the stormtroopers who smashed out our windows, knocked down our doors, attacked our officers first, showing the crowd how to become a mob. And then they came in and, for the first time in American history, shut down the counting of Electoral College votes. So the white nationalists were able both to influence a broader conservative public, the people who showed up for the demonstration, but also to work in league with people at the very highest levels of political organizing in the Republican Party around Donald Trump. So they considered that day a great victory for them. And if you read their websites, they regret only not having their weapons with them and having left their weapons back in the cars or in the hotels or motels, which they needed to do in order to get into the rally with the president down at the White House. But we very nearly lost it all on January 6th. And for them, as well as for Donald Trump, this is a day that they will commemorate and lionize. And of course, the political scientists would tell you that the biggest indicator of a successful coup is a recently failed coup, where the coup plotters get to diagram the weaknesses in the existing structure. So we have to discover what those weaknesses were. We need to fortify our democratic institutions and understand that a mass violent fascist street movement has been born in the United States on January the 6th.
Thank you. That context is very helpful and definitely underscores that we are in an inflection point in our country, and that this rise of radicalism has real world consequences. Just yesterday at the Senate Judiciary hearing on hate crimes, the president of Dillard University talked about how historically Black colleges are now receiving threats for choosing to host a polling place location for the upcoming midterms. So if we fast forward to the upcoming midterms, I mean, you've had a front row seat to how political violence can impact elections. How real do you think the political threat of violence for the upcoming midterm election is? Should we be worried, and what should the government response be?
Well, January the 6th was the culmination of a lot of different episodes of political violence. Remember back to what happened in Lansing, Michigan, when the Michigan state capitol was surrounded and stormed by militia groups and extremist groups who came armed with military-style assault weapons, and then that turned into a plot to kidnap and assassinate Governor Whitmer. We saw similar kinds of activity at state capitals all over the country. And of course, January 6th itself was an attempt to derail the election and to overthrow Biden's majority in the Electoral College. So I would say, until we have a definitive renunciation of violence, not just by the Democratic Party, but by the Republican Party and by political leaders across the spectrum, the threat is going to be there. And when you look at what's taken place at school boards across the country, since January the 6th, there's been an effort by Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and other extremist groups to go out and to create local visibility all across the country.
So in our few remaining moments, I have two questions for you. The first one really is about leadership. I mean, candidly, I believe we're in a crisis of moral courage and leadership. There are GOP leaders who have channeled hate and filled the public square with toxic rhetoric that have emboldened extremism. And a part of our policy recommendations in our report points out the fact that leaders play an important role in condemning hate when they see it. And astoundingly, we haven't seen as much pushback from GOP leaders to condemn hate when they see it. Words matter. And in our report, we talk about how it is important to really push back on the rhetoric. How concerned are you about some of your Republican colleagues leveraging fear and hate to undermine our democratic institutions? That's the first question. And the second question that we will end on is, what gives you hope?
Well, I'm very concerned about our GOP colleagues participating in Donald Trump's attempt to whitewash and sanitize what took place on January 6th. And Trump has revised the whole history. Now he says that the election took place on January 6th and the insurrection took place on November 3rd, where he continues to propound the big lie and say the election was stolen from him. He has now built January 6th into the big lie, saying that his followers greeted the police officers there with flowers and hugs and kisses. And there are just way too many Republicans who are willing to indulge this. It may be that Trump went so far out on a limb that it's possible that the limb is going to break with Vladimir Putin, describing Putin as a genius and brilliant and savvy and everything for his attack on the democratic government of Ukraine. But this was no surprise to us because Trump and his party are now in league with the anti-democratic forces and governments and movements of the world, whether we're talking about Putin in Russia or Orban in Hungary or Duterte in the Philippines or El-Sisi in Egypt or the homicidal crown prince of Saudi Arabia, whatever it might be. And, we have a struggle right now between democratic governments and movements and peoples against autocratic governments and movements and peoples. And that's right now what's taking place on planet Earth. But I'll tell you what gives me a lot of hope is that the vast majority of Americans reject that kind of hate-based extremism. It is an attempt to release these monsters and demons from the 20th century, and the vast majority of people just reject it and don't stand by it. But it will be a race between the will of the majority, the belief of the majority in democratic institutions and processes, versus this attempt to suppress the vote and use the filibuster and gerrymandering and other mechanisms like that to dilute the will of the majority. So the struggle for civil rights and for basic dignity for everybody is a struggle for democracy and majority will in the new century that we're in.
Thank you so much, Congressman Raskin. We certainly appreciate your words of wisdom here. And now I'll turn it over to Leisha.
Thank you, LaShawn. Thank you, Congressman Raskin. And thank you, everyone, for staying with us today. It's been quite a rich discussion about SPLC's 2021 Year in Hate and Extremism report. So if you have additional questions or would like to interview any SPLC expert, please email us at press@splcenter.org. Thank you again. Take good care.